My dear students, I'm delighted to welcome you to this part 5 of the last part of the presentation on chapter 1, Concepts of Governance and Management of Information Systems. In this part, we'll be discussing information systems assurance. This is in the context of governance and management. We are not going to talk about generic information system assurance assignments, but we're going to talk about specific assignments pertaining to information systems in the context of governance and management. And we'll also be using example of how COBIT could be used for the purpose of performing IS assurance assignments. Let's have a quick recap of what are the topics we're going to cover in this presentation. We'll look at how COBIT could be used for IS assurance. How do you evaluate IT governance structure, especially from an internal audit perspective. We'll look at a sample GRC assignment and the scope and the areas of review from the internal audit perspective. We'll look at how do you assess and manage the risks, which means if you have to do an audit of risk management, how do you identify the scope and identify the areas for review. And we'll also look at how do you evaluate internal controls. Now, if you look at all the three key aspects, whether it's evaluate governance, GRC or review, all these are aspects pertaining to concepts of governance. And you find internal controls are basic, which are required for any type of an IT audit assignment, which means for any IS assurance assignments, you will be reviewing the internal controls as required. So let's look at the generic process pertaining to information systems assurance assignments. Why is it required? Now, this gives you a general idea that management requires assurance to be able to provide them assurance so that they have trust in information technology. So they have confidence in the information system which processes the information using the information technology. As auditors, we are already aware of how to audit any type of information system. Now, the important aspect we need to consider is how do you audit an information technology environment? If you look at any business process, we know how to evaluate a business process. We know how to understand the regulatory requirements as required for the assignment. We also are aware of the organizational structure which has to be evaluated. We are also aware of the technology which is being used. Now, the important thing is, in the current environment, all these aspects have become inbuilt. Now, whether you look at the business process, the organizational structure, the regulatory requirements, or the compliance requirements, all these have become embedded in technology. The internal controls which are to be evaluated are inbuilt inside information technology. So this is where we need to know that we have to get the right skill sets. We need to use the right tools. And that's the key distinction between information systems audit and general audit. Most of the process or the life cycle of assurance, in the case of IS assurance also, is similar. There is a planning phase where you plan the assignment. You'll scope the assignment depending on the need of the assignment, depending on the objective of the assignment. You'll execute and perform the assignment based on the audit objectives. And this is where the key distinction is. In the case of information system assets, we are not only looking at the technology environment, we'll also use the technology itself by using the right tools and techniques for the purpose of doing the audit. And this is the important skill gap where the CAs and CA students have to equip themselves. And the final part is reporting. There is an important distinction between a general audit assignment and a IS assurance assignment. In the case of reporting, in most of the general assignments, you have a standard structured report which is provided. So you have to present the report in this particular way. But information system assurance assignments are more like an internal audit. The scope, objectives, and the reporting format would be decided by the management. So you have to decide how you're going to report. Another important distinction is in the case of a typical audit, which is of a general compliance nature, let's say tax audit or VAT audit, the time you spend on planning probably could be only 10% or less than 10%. The time you spend on scoping could be less than 10%. The time on execution could be around 70%. And whereas the time you spend on reporting could be only 10%. So if you look at actual execution, more than 70% of the time is spent in execution. But in the case of information system assignments, planning itself could take about 20%. The scope of the assignment, depending on the need, where you understand the business process, could take about 20%. The actual performing of the assignment could be only about 40% because you use the required tools and techniques to be able to audit. and reporting you may spend 20 to 30%, which means fundamentally you spend more time in planning, scoping, and reporting, and less time in execution because you follow a standard structured approach, and you can use technology itself for the purpose of audit. Now let's look at the testing methods which could be adopted. Now most of the testing methods which you adopt in the generic audit approach are also similar. For example, you do an inquiry. What is the inquiry for? To understand the business process, to understand the control environment. Audit, they say, is the process of collecting and evaluating evidence. So you need to first know how to collect the evidence, and you need to know how to evaluate this evidence. Now, the key criteria, especially in the case of an IT environment, is this evidence which is there, which was available earlier in the form of physical books, records, etc. Now, this record has become digital, which means this has become embedded inside information technology. So, inside information technology, you have the data. Now, as an auditor, when you want to collect this evidence, you need to know how to access the technology and get inside, dive down, and pick up the data for the purpose of audit. So when you inquire also, you should know what you are inquiring. You should be able to ask the right questions to information technology to be able to get the questions. You also do an inspection. In the case of a manual environment, you do a physical inspection of the documents all over the place. In the case of information technology information, most of the information could be digital. So you'll have to change that methodology. Similarly, you have observation. Observation is also important. But to some extent, in the case of IS assurance assignment, this could be lesser. You reperform. Now, in the case of a manual environment, quite often you do reperformance based on a sampling. Whereas in the case of IS assurance, you can actually do a 100% audit because you can use the technology itself to verify whether the audit is possible, whether the compliance have been built in. For example, let's say I want to verify whether the VAT computation has been done correctly or the TDS computation has been done correctly. In a manual environment, let's say the company has got about 60,000 vouchers. I may pick up at random depending on the number of a particular number of samples to do the reperformance or verify whether the computation is correct. Whereas in the case of a computerized environment, I can download the data into Excel or to the information software, and then I can actually do a detailed reperformance, and in a few seconds I can get the result to confirm whether all the calculations are right or that I can identify the exceptions. So which means you can also do the recalculations or reperformance, and you can perform analysis. In the case of IS assurance, most of the time is spent in actually analysis. For example, if you remember, we talked about information systems is all about identifying the risk. They look at the security and looking at the controls which need to be implemented. When you find there is a control weakness, this is what you're going to do in audit. You need to analyze and find out what happened, what is the impact, what is the exposure, what is the consequence. And this is where a significant amount of time of IS assurance is spent. And you can also do sampling, which means you can trace the transaction from the origination to the destination. Now let's look at the components of an IS assurance initiative. For example, if you look at a financial statement audit, you'll have a set of financial statement assertions which could be pertaining to completeness, which could be pertaining to cutoff, it could be pertaining to valuation or existence check, or you're looking at validation or disclosure or transparency. You decide what are the list of financial statement assertions which are mandated as per the regulatory requirements, and these need to be translated into specific processing objectives, which means controls you need to evaluate. For example, you need to verify completeness. You need to verify the cutoff. So in that case, if you're looking at cutoff, which means transactions of the financial year only are recorded during the year. So if that's the case, you can actually use the information system, analyze the digital data, and find out whether any transactions which are beyond the accounting period. So you can look at completeness, accuracy, validity, or you can also look at restricted assets, restricted access. The way access controls are implemented in the case of information systems environment could be completely different. This is also another important distinction between a general audit assignment and an information systems audit assignments. In the case of a general audit, there is a standard report, there is a standard format, and most of the cases you also know that you can follow a consistent approach. The same thing is applicable in the case of IS assurance also. You have a planning, this is what you could look at. Now just look at the distinction here. When you're planning, you will also consider the IT assurance universe, which means what is the information technology which is deployed within the enterprise. What is the information technology? You remember very clearly, we talked about the facilities, which are required to house the information systems. You have the operating system, and then you have the database, then you have the application software, and then inside you've got the data. So this is the application environment. Now these computers which are there could be networked, which means you also need to know what the type of a network environment they have. Who are the people? Now you also have people within the organization structure who can access this information. So you need to know what is the segregation of duties, how this information is actually organized so that employees can access the information. So when you're doing any type of an IS assurance assignment, you need to understand what is the assurance universe, especially pertaining to the IT. You also decide what is the best practices framework you're going to use for the purpose of audit as a benchmark. You perform a risk-based IT assurance planning, which means you decide what are the critical areas which need to be audited, and you perform a high-level review or a compliance review to check what is the level of compliance within the organization. Based on the controls, then you define what are the detailed control objectives which you're going to verify. Then you scope the assignment. This is where you define for each of the areas you selected or the process you selected, what are the process goals which the enterprise is set, what are the audit objectives for this. You also decide what are the IT goals which have been set, the specific IT process and the resources which are being used to achieve the business processes, what are the specific control objectives. Now control objectives are the key for the purpose of any IS assurance assignments, because control objectives tell you what is the objective you're going to achieve by implementing the specific controls. In terms of definition, they say control objectives are specific control procedures or activities to be performed to achieve the control objectives. To achieve the controls, meet the required criteria. Which means when you're implementing a particular control, you have a set objective to be achieved. This is called as a control objective. For example, what is the objective of taking a backup? Control objective of taking a backup. The control objective for taking a backup is to ensure the data is available in the case of an emergency. So that's the control objectives. So you'll use this as a benchmark or a valid assertion which you're going to validate and verify. So you may also execute this assignment. In the case of executing this assignment, you look at the subject of area of audit, you determine the scope of the key control objectives which are going to be there, you test the effectiveness, how these controls have been implemented, document the impact of these control weaknesses, and based on that, you come to conclusions and recommendations. Now, if you remember, we talked about risk, security, and then controls. Now, as an auditor, you're going to review this and verify whether the risks are mitigated by appropriate controls. If the risk is less than controls, which means, it's the risk is greater than controls, which means there is a control weakness. And control weakness means there is a control which has not yet been, risk which has not yet been mitigated. Now the same thing, let me show diagrammatically. When you understand the technology environment, you need to understand what are the facilities which are required to house the technology. What is meant by the facilities? It is the place, it is the environment for the purpose of running the information technology. You have the operating system, which is actually the heart of the computer, which makes the computer resources available to the user. Then you have the database, which actually stores all the data. This database is accessed through the application software. The application software is the one which actually runs the business, which is accessed by the users. And this application software stores all the data which is of the organization. And data or information is the most valuable asset for the organization. If you take up a bank and you look at the technology they use, if you look at a core banking solution, you have the facilities, which is the data center. Now, inside the data center, they have computers, and inside the computer will have an operating system. Let's say it could be SCO Unix. Now, they might be using a database, which is, let's say, Oracle. They may have application software, which is, let's say, Finacle. And then you have data, which is stored inside the database. Now, the users could be internal or they could be external. Now, who are the internal users? They are the employees who are within the organization. Now, these are the internal users. Now, these internal users need to access this information. How do they access the information? They access the information based on need to know and a need to do basis. Which means to perform the job, they need to know certain things. And for that, they need to do certain things. So this is a principle based on how they access the information. This is called as a need to know and a need to do basis. Okay. Now, if for example, if you look at a CEO, he'll also access the information pertaining to the data, but he'll access at a particular level. Similarly, a person who is working in a particular department, now he'll access the data depending on the access principles. For example, the access principles could be, can I come in? This is the first question the user has to ask. Second question is, where can I go? And third question is, what can I do? Now, if you look at this question, for example, a user in a bank wants to log in. So first question is, can I come in? Which means what that we're checking? We are looking at identification and authentication. Where can I go? For example, I'm working fixed deposits. The user can go to the fixed deposit. What can I do? In fixed deposits, the user can only, let's say, do the data entry. Then the access has to be restricted based on this. Now, all this data which is available inside the information technology will be accessed through the application software. As far the user is concerned, he will access the application software. Through the application software, depending on the area of work, he'll be able to get that particular type of a data. Similarly, if you're a customer, now as a customer, let's say you have a savings account. If you're a customer with having savings account, first question you'll ask is whether user ID has been created. Using the user ID, you access the application software. Now, based on the application software, you are a customer of savings account. This is where you can go. You can go to savings account. And then what can you do? You can only access the data. For example, you cannot do the transactions, which means you can access the data and you can perform only read-only access, which means you can only view the data. Assurance techniques, we discussed earlier. So you do a planning, you'll perform a quick risk assessment, you assess the threats, vulnerability in the business impact, determine the risk pertaining to the project, plan risk-based assurance initiatives. You also identify the critical IT process based on value drivers and also assess how well the controls are implemented and what is the process maturity of the organization. What are the key factors to be considered in assurance? Now, if you remember, I talked about this. You understand the business process. You understand the regulatory requirements which are applicable. Now you understand the organizational structure. You also need to understand the technology deployed. Now this is what is required in the case of assurance. In the case of a typical general audit, for example, let's say a VAT audit or a tax audit or a service tax audit, primarily you are looking at technology only from the point of, okay, you have to look at the regulatory requirements pertaining to VAT or service tax. You look at the business process which is being met, and then you also look at organizational structure in terms of who can access what. Now the beauty is, in the case of technology, all these aspects are actually embedded inside the organization, inside technology. For example, you have the business process, you have the regulatory requirements, you have the organizational structure, you also have the policies, procedures, etc., which are pertaining to the organization. All these are embedded inside technology, which means the internal controls, the regulatory requirements, everything inside technology. So as an auditor, you need to understand how this information system works. Only then you can do an audit, an effective audit. Now this gives you another perspective of how do you do a risk-based audit approach. You gather the information and plan. So here you find typically you need to understand the business and the industry, look at the prior year audit reports, also look at financial information, you look at the regulatory requirements, you also do an inherent risk assessment, what can go wrong, and then obtain understanding of how the internal controls are implemented. That's in terms of the control environment, the control procedures which the enterprise has implemented. Also do a detection risk assessment in terms of how the risks are implemented. You also perform a quick review of the controls to understand at a macro level how controls have been set up. And based on that, you identify what the total risk which is prevalent in the organization. And based on this, you perform the compliance test. Compliance test, as I said, focus on comply, which means they look at the compliance factor at a macro level, which means, for example, you look at the configuration of the interest, whether the interest has been properly set in the parameters. Based on that, you perform the detailed substantive tests. There's one important principle you need to remember, that you have to identify what are the key controls you need to test. And you also perform tests of reliability. It could be pertaining to risk prevention, adherence, and you are looking at the policies and procedures. Based on the results of the compliance test, you will decide what the extent of substantive tests you need to perform. Now, substantive tests, as the word means, this is substantial, which means the details. If the compliance tests show that the controls are working well, the extent of reliance on substantive tests would be lesser. If the compliance test shows that the controls are weak, then the extent of substantial testing which you do, the detailed testing would be much more higher. So you perform, in the case of substantial testing, analytical procedures, you look at the detailed test of the balances, and based on that you identify the findings and create the report which is based on the recommendations, which includes all the recommendations, and you write the audit report. Let's look at scoping. So in the scoping is where you actually look at what are the control objectives you need to be implemented, and for the critical process which is subject to audit, you also need to customize the control objectives. You execute or perform the audit. Based on the understanding of the IT deployment, you also need to refine the scope or update the scope. So you look at the key control objectives, test the effectiveness of the control in terms of design, how the design has been implemented. Because in the case of IT, you need to remember, if the control is working once, you can be sure that the same control, if it is working same way, it will work any number of times. So you look at the design, test the outcome of the control objectives which you have tested, look at the result, document the impact of the control weakness, what are findings you have. You need to look at primarily from the point, the materiality which is there is going to be a little different in the case of IS assurance. In the case of materiality, for the purpose of financial statement audit, you look at the value and the volume for the purpose of determining whether it's material. Whereas in the case of IS audit, you're going to look at materiality from the point of the impact or the consequence. So what is the potential loss? For example, access has not been properly defined. So in that case, when you look at access has not been properly defined, nothing has happened to the organization. Okay, for example, a user who's working as a clerk in the accounts department has also access to the general ledger. He can also go and update the general ledger. He can create a vendor. So in that case, nothing has happened so far. But the risk is that the user who can enter the data can also modify and update the data. He's got access more than what is required. So in that case, that is a material point. Although in terms of the value of the volume, nothing might have happened. You also develop and communicate the overall conclusion and recommendations. So in the case of overall conclusions, you also need to do a risk rating. And you prepare or report the assurance conclusions. Now, this assurance conclusions have to be reported in a standard report, which could be pre-agreed right before you take up the IS assurance assignment, or the auditee may provide a standard format in which they want the audit report to be provided. Now, let's look at audit planning. This gives you a general understanding. You find most of these are similar to what you do in a general audit. You need to understand the business objective, business purpose, designs, etc. You identify the stated content, what are the policies, standards, guidelines which are going to be used as the benchmark for validation. You look at the risk assessment and then the impact to the privacy as applicable, perform a risk analysis. You conduct an internal control review, how well the controls are implemented, and you set the audit scope and audit objectives, and develop the audit approach or the audit strategy in terms of how it is going to be done. You also decide what are the personnel which are going to be deployed, what is going to be the requirements in terms of skill set for the purpose of performing the assignment, and also for the logistics where it is going to be performed. So there's nothing special as far as the assignment is concerned. Let's look at this. Now, what are the regulatory requirements? Let's look at the regulatory requirements. The regulatory requirements may also say what is going to be impacting for the organization. So you need to understand what are the requirements which are applicable and decide and include it as a part of your audit. So these are some of the aspects you need to consider. Identify the external requirements, decide what are the pertinent rules and regulations that are applicable, assess whether the management have considered, assess the management and the IS function have considered whether all the external requirements have been taken care of. For example, let's say you're developing an accounting software in-house. If you're developing the accounting software in-house, you also need to decide whether all the controls which are there for the organization. For example, let's say you're the software for accounting and it's supposed to take care of purchase and sales, and VAT is applicable. You also need to consider that the VAT rates as applicable to the organization. The reports which are to be filed are actually developed and inbuilt in the software. Review the internal IS audit departments in terms of the adherence to the applicable laws, have they understood how they have done, and you need to determine what the adherence to the company's policy, to the procedures which have been established. So as an IS auditor, now if you look at when you want to use COBIT, okay, you're looking at using COBIT, now this is what would happen. So you need to first of all understand the business process, which you know in most of the cases you would have done. You need to understand the enterprise policies, procedures, and practices as implemented, which actually, if you remember the definition of control, we said control refers to the policy, procedure, practices, and the organizational structure designed to provide reasonable assurance that business objectives are achieved and undesired events are prevented or detected and corrected. So you'll understand what is the control architecture. You'll understand the internal control structure primarily from the point of how IT is deployed. And you'll also understand the organizational structure in terms of who can have access, what is the organogram, who can access what are the authorization policies. There are some principles pertaining to COBIT. You should know that COBIT has been designed to meet the requirements of multiple stakeholders, including the auditors, consultants, and regulators. So the same documents, the same management practices can be used by the auditors, can be used by the consultant or the regulators from different perspectives depending on the need. So if I'm doing an ISO assurance assignment, which is a consulting, I can look at using COBIT management practices, let's say pertaining to business continuity, to use it as a benchmark to check whether they're actually implemented and what are the areas of improvement. The same thing if I'm using the management practices for BCP, if I'm looking from the external audit perspective, depending on the scope, I may use the same management practices and modify or adopt it as required. So you know COBIT can also be used from a GRC perspective. Internationally, or you can say globally, COBIT has been used along with COSO. For example, in most of the cases when you're using SOX, you find COSO is used as a framework for implementing enterprise risk management, and under COSO, you use COBIT as a framework for GEIT or IT governance. And under that, you may also use different frameworks such as the ISO standard for information security. For example, you may use ISO 27001. Let's understand some key terminologies pertaining to audit. I'm sure most of you know this. We talked about controls. We talked about control objectives earlier. A statement of the desired result or purpose to be achieved by implementing the control procedures in a specific activity, especially in IT activity. Then you have IT governance. Then you have IT assurance. What is assurance planning? Now this gives you more clarity on this. First, you need to understand the assurance universe, understand the business goals, how these are going to be audited, the specific IT process and the IT resources. Now, what is the level of understanding and the knowledge you need to have depends on the nature of the enterprise which you're auditing, depending on the environment, the technology environment, depending on the specific risks which are pertaining to the assignment, and also depending on the objective. To execute this assignment, to perform this assignment, it's important that you need to adopt a standardized and a structured approach. And this is where COBIT could be useful. So you can use COSO as a macro enterprise risk management framework. You can use COBIT, and you can also use ISO 27001. ITIL is used more from the point of service management perspective. So when you're auditing service delivery. So let's look at an example of how do you evaluate IT governance structure and practices, especially from an internal audit perspective. So here, if you remember, we're looking at IT governance structure, whether the enterprise has implemented the right IT governance structure or mechanisms. So what are the key components when you look at IT governance structure? So if you're evaluating the structure of IT governance, you'll look at what are the leadership mechanisms which have been built inside the organization, what is the organization information system structure. You'll understand what are the key business processes which are there. You also understand the risk and the risk management strategy adopted with the organization. You'll understand what is the control architecture, how controls have been implemented. And you'll also have to understand how the performance is being measured. What are the performance measure metrics which are there? So based on these key areas of audit, you will actually define the scope and prepare the detailed control objectives, which will be adopted for COBIT. It could be from the control management practice, control objectives or the management practices. So you develop the benchmark specific to specific area and do the review and identify whether the controls are working as per the benchmark and are there any areas of control weaknesses. You assess the risks, implement the appropriate security, whether the organization implemented the right level of security and controls. So when you're doing an IS audit, what are the key areas? The focus on the risks, the focus on the controls, and check the 3 A's pertaining to controls, which is whether controls are available, whether controls are adequate, and whether the controls are appropriate. These are the three key things you will be looking at. Now let's say controls are not available. If the controls are not available, what is the impact? Which means the risks are not mitigated. What will happen on account of this? If the risks are not mitigated, there is an exposure. What is an exposure? There is a potential loss. Okay, now which means this potential loss has the management knowingly accepted. Now, depending on the cost benefit analysis, they need to decide whether it is acceptable. Now, let's look at the next stage. Now, we are talking about controls which are not adequate. So, in this case, what is happening? You have got controls which are not adequate. So, you got controls which are available. So, when you look at controls, are they available? First question you say, yes. It's yes. Okay. Next question you're going to ask, are they adequate? And you say it is no. If it is no, then what do? You're looking at adequate and you say yes. You look at no. Now, if it is no, then what is that you're looking at? You find that controls are available, but they're not adequate, which means the controls are less than the risk, which means there is a residual risk. Now, this residual risk could result in an exposure, and the exposure, is the potential loss. And same thing applies to appropriate, so I don't need to repeat the story. I'm sure you got the gist of the idea. Based on the above steps, you need to identify what are the control weaknesses and then decide or recommend what steps the management has to take to mitigate this risk. Let's look at another example. Here we look at GRC review from the perspective of internal audit using COBIT. So you define the scope, define what are the areas of governance which you're going to look at, define what are the culture, ethics, and behavior of the enterprise, define how the risk management process is being done. You also decide how this rules pertaining to COBIT, the practices pertaining to COBIT have been interpreted. And you also decide in terms of the risk and the exposures within the enterprise as they exist. You also look at the potential for the fraud and fraud risk. These are some of the key aspects you look at GRC when you do a GRC review. Now, this gives you some sample assignments which can be done when you use COBIT. For example, using COBIT, I can design an information security assignment. I can do a business continuity planning assignment. We can do a risk assessment, or I can also do a compliance assignment, or an assurance, any type of assurance assignment, or an IP protection assignment. So using COBIT, you can define what is the area you're going to audit. Depending on the need of the audit assignment, for example, the client requires an audit for the purpose of, let's say, compliance, and he wants to do an independent review of IFC. So from COBIT, you'll pick up what is required for the purpose of audit. Let's say for the purpose of a review from the point of IFC, you decide, let's say, the entity level controls, and then you decide the process level controls. Okay. So what you could do is you can look at COBIT as the framework of governance, go and pick up the relevant processes, and under the process you have got certain management practices, and the management practices you adopt as required for the ALC, as required for the PLC, depending on the technology framework which is used, and you perform an audit. Now remember, here we're not getting into detailed types of information system assignments. There is a separate chapter which covers the information systems assignments or information systems audit, which is given in ISCA. But I think most of the core principles of IS audit, which I'm covering here, is also relevant for the other chapter. So when you look at GRC, you know what is GRC all about. So this is a generic umbrella term, and this is being used why you're looking primarily in terms of alignment and integration to improve performance and deliver the stakeholder value. This is the audit objective. So what is the audit objective in GRC? One of the audit objectives is looking at governance mechanisms within the enterprise, how risk management is being done, and also looking at how the compliance are being taken care of. So here we are looking at not just the details, we are looking at the systems and processes which are in place in the organization. Now let's look at another example. We are looking at sample areas for review for assessing and managing risks. Now, which means here, what is assessing and managing risk? Which means fundamentally we're talking about the risk management process within the enterprise. So what could be the areas of review? You look at how the risk management ownership is established within the organization. How is the accountability established? You'll also look at what are the different types of risks which are there for the organization. You'll define and communicate the risk tolerance profile based on the risk appetite which has been defined by the top management, the risk tolerance limits which have been set for various groups or various types of operations. You perform a root cause analysis and the risk mitigation measures. And you'll also do a qualitative and quantitative risk measurement in terms of different types of risks when they actualize what could be the impact depending on the probability, the threat, and the vulnerability. You'll also identify what the risk assessment methodology which is used by the organization and check whether it actually meets the enterprise requirements, whether it's adequate and appropriate to meet the enterprise requirements, and whether this is fulfilling the objectives of risk management as required for the enterprise. And if they use any standard framework, you also need to verify this. You also need to look at fundamentally what is the risk action plan, which means when they identify a risk or when the risk happens, what is the action plan which they take to mitigate the risk, and how do they do a timely or a periodic risk assessment. This could be the different areas of a review for a risk management review as per the information systems audit using COBIT. Now let's look at one more example pertaining to review and assessing the internal controls. So here we are not talking about internal controls in a specific area, we are talking about the system of internal control itself. This is what is given in the corporate governance as per the company's law in the clause 49 requirements. And this is also required as per the IFC requirements now. So we are looking not just at the internal controls at the separate specific application software, we are looking at the system level in terms of how the control mechanisms are initiated in terms of the policy level, what are the different types of internal controls that are applicable at the environment level, including the assessment independent assurance reviews which are being done. We also look at the process which the management follows to identify the deficiencies in the internal controls and what are the improvement actions which are taken. You'll also plan, organize, and maintain what are the standards which are applicable for internal control assessment and for assurance activities. Further, you will identify the key management practices which are adopted by the organization for internal controls review. So this could be pertaining to monitor the internal controls, review the business process, how these are implemented. You also see whether they're doing a control self-assessment to verify by the user themselves whether the controls are implemented and if there are any weaknesses there, identify the control deficiencies and how do they rectify after they're reported or when they find this. Some more aspect. What is the role of the assurance providers? So you need to ensure that the auditor is independent and also has the right qualification. You also plan the assurance initiatives using a standard approach, systematic approach. You scope the assurance initiatives and you execute the assurance initiatives based on a standard approach. And if you remember, we talked about execution. You need to use the required tools and techniques, which means you use technology itself as a tool for the purpose of doing the audit, to be able to access the data which is residing in the information system and to be able to verify the internal controls and identify whether the controls are available, adequate, and appropriate. Now let's look at a GRC and assurance. Now there are a set of published policies which are applicable to the organization. And these published policies keep on increasing based on the regulatory requirements, based on the business environment, based on the specific industry best practices they want to adopt. So there is a set of published policies which the organization has to adhere. You also have restrictions pertaining to the budget. There is an installed user base and we have existing process. Now all this actually contribute to increase in the published policies. So it means the policies which have to be adhered to keep on increasing. But practically what would happen is, due to the corporate culture within the organization, the actual policies which are adhered to will get lesser, which means many of the policies are there. There's a big gap. There are published policies, but actual policies which are followed is much more lesser, and many of them are in paper and they're not really implemented. Now, what is the benefit of using frameworks like COBIT? So when you use best practices like COBIT, what could happen is The adherence to the published policies keeps improving because this contributes to improvements in the culture. Now let's look at the sample questions. First question is, explain different components of an assurance initiative. Now remember the important distinction which I told you. Assurance is generic in nature. In the case of information systems assurance, we are looking at assurance which is pertaining to the information systems which are enabled through information technology. So it means you need to understand the technology environment, which means that typically what is applicable for a generic assurance assignment is applicable. In addition to that, you'll also look at the technology environment and the related controls. And based on that, you develop the audit approach. Explain the step-by-step approach for assurance outlined in COBIT. So we've discussed this. Explain briefly the primary task for the IS auditors in performing an IS audit. This also should be quite clear. So you know that in the case of IS audit, you'll define the scope, you plan, define the scope, execute this, report it. You'll also do a detailed risk assessment. You'll also perform compliance testing, subtype testing as required. These are the different types of tests you can perform. You may also perform analytical procedures review. Outline sample area of the review by internal auditors. We have seen these details. We just clearly pertaining to GRC. It could be pertaining to assess risk management, which means you look at how the risks are being managed within the enterprise, what process they follow, what are the structured approach they follow, and based on that, what are the actions which are taken based on the reviews which is done. Now, the next question is pertaining to key management practices for assessing and evaluating the system internal controls. We have discussed this a few minutes ago. Let's come to the last question. Explain how to map and review application controls. Okay, now this is what is not there covered in the study material. So in this case, you need to remember, quite often you can't expect the questions to come exactly from what is there in the study material. But if you know the generic concept of how an IS assurance is done, in most of the cases, you remember the chart which you talked about. You need to understand the business process. You need to understand the organized structure. You need to understand the regulatory requirements. You need to understand the policy, procedures, and practices of the internal control structure. All these are embedded inside the technology. Now, if you're auditing, let's say, an application software, now the application software meets certain business requirements. The application software also facilitates you to create an organizational structure. The application software also has embedded or included the regulatory requirements. For example, let's say banking software will also have requirements pertaining to the regulatory requirements, pertaining to the tax deduction which has to be done, or pertaining to the rules pertaining to operation of the FCNR accounts, or opening of accounts by NRE accounts. So all the business rules pertaining to the organization may also be built in the application software. So when you're looking at application controls, what is important to know is you should know what does the application software do. And based on that specific business application software, you need to reply. So in this case, it's very generic. So you should also give generic answer, but should be focused on the application software. Okay. Same thing if it's pertaining to database software, you also need to look at the same criteria and you have to customize as required. I hope with this, you have got a clarity on what is information systems assurance all about from a governance perspective. Remember, in this case, I was talking about IS assurance not from a generic perspective, but primarily from a governance perspective. Now, this is not covering in detail the different types of IS audit assignments which can be done. There is a separate chapter which gives you the IS audit approach, which you may refer to separately. Let's have a quick recap of what we have discussed so far. Now, remember, this was in the context of governance and management of information system, which is covered in chapter 1. And this is the last part of the presentation where you're talking about IS assurance. IS assurance can be done for any specific area. Now here we are looking at how IS assurance can be done using COBIT. So in the first part of this presentation, we looked at using COBIT for IS assurance, how you can customize and adopt from COBIT. And we also looked at evaluating the IT governance structure using COBIT. And we also saw if you have to do a GRC review, what are the areas scope which we have to identify from an internal audit point of view. We also saw another example of assessing and managing the risk, which is the risk management strategy which has to be adopted by the organization. And we also saw you can also do a review of internal controls. So you see here, basically what you're talking about is when you look at governance, governance is about ERM, governance is about risk management, and governance is about implementing the right level of internal controls. Using COBIT, you can actually implement a system of governance, which means the management can use COBIT for the purpose of implementing governance. The same content in COBIT can be used by the auditor for the purpose of validating and verifying whether the management has implemented governance in the required way. And these are some examples of how you can actually do this. You can look at the IT governance structure which has been established in the organization. You look at the process the organization has for GRC review. You can look at the risk management review, or you can also look at the internal control systems and processes the organization has. So to summarize the discussion we had so far, at a macro level, you have this enterprise governance and the corporate governance. And this is the summary of the chapter 1 because this is the last part of the presentation. Enterprise governance as applied to information technology at enterprise level becomes governance of enterprise IT. For implementing governance of enterprise IT, you also need to implement enterprise risk management. You need to have a system of internal controls, and you can use the COBIT principles enablers. I hope you remember the 5 principles and the 7 enablers of COBIT. Now, I said in most of the case of ISCA, you don't need to remember, but these 5 principles and 7 enablers you need to remember. I'm sure with the type of information you remember, I gave you the relationship. The starting point is policies, principles, and framework, and then you know what are the 3 resources, and you should also be knowing what are the 3 intangible resources. And we also have the 5, and you remember the starting point. We talked about meeting the stakeholder needs. You can also use COBIT for GRC. We have discussed this in detail. And the last part of this presentation, in this presentation, we talked about how you can use COBIT for assurance. Now, with this presentation, I'm sure you should have a clarity on how you can implement COBIT for the purpose of governance and management of information system. Now, if you see, this chapter is primarily about governance and management, and COBIT is a tool. COBIT 5 is a tool which can be used for implementing governance and management. So the knowledge pertaining to governance and management and COBIT are all interrelated or linked together. Let's have a quick review of the topics we have covered. In part 1 of the presentation, these are the topics we have gone through. So if you see, in all the areas pertaining to part 1, we are focusing on governance, the different concepts of governance, the different meanings of governance. In part 2, we looked at the role of IT in enterprises and also how IT strategic planning is done. Now, if you remember the key word here, we are talking about alignment. Now, if you remember the key word in governance, we talked about direction and control. And part 3 of the presentation, we discussed what is risk management all about. Now, this is where you had the ISCA. And then part 4 of the presentation, we discussed about how COBIT is a generic framework, a business framework for implementing GIT in any enterprise. Most of the modern enterprises, which are highly dependent on information technology, need to use a framework such as COBIT. And that's what is being mandated in many cases by using frameworks or controls such as ISC, SOX, Clause 49 requirements. We also saw how a IT compliance review can be done. In this presentation, the last part 5, we saw how information systems assurance can be done, and primarily for governance and management. And we are also giving you a summary of what is covered in chapter 1. Chapter 1 typically, if you look at, because these concepts are pertaining to governance and management, they seem to be like a vegetable in the group of fruits. But you need to remember, this can be very simplified by just getting the context right. And what is the context? You need to remember, ISCA is all about management of technology. What are the system of management which you need to have for technology? And once you know this, you should also know how to audit this technology. If you keep this perspective, then you find understanding the subject becomes very easy. So what is the ISCA perspective? If you look at the flow of the chapters, you have the governance and management. We establish the overall framework. Based on this, for auditing this, you need to understand the information system. This information systems is actually embedded in the information technology, and this technology components which you already drawn, which I showed you, If you remember the facilities, the operating system, database, application, and the data. Now you need to ensure that this data is protected. The complete information system has to be protected. Now, in spite of all the precautions, there could be failure of technology, and that's where you need to ensure you have a BCP and DRP, and this is a separate chapter. And then you have application software, which is the core of any organization. And this application software may be procured or may be developed in-house. So you need to have this standard process and systems for ensuring that SDLC, System Development Lifecycle Review, the organization is following appropriate best practices procedures to ensure that the application software is implemented as planned. The right application software is procured and implemented as required. And all this is covered in the chapter pertaining to SDLC. And then you have auditing of IS, which talks about how do you audit this information system. So when you audit IS, you could be looking at auditing governance, you could be auditing the information technology framework, you could be looking at the security, which is the protection of information assets in terms of CIA. You could perform an IS audit of the BCP or the DRP, or it could be SDLC, or it could be any specific area. So the scope of and objective of the audit in the case of information systems audit could vary. I hope with this you have got more clarity. This subject of what ISCA is all about. Climbing the ladder of ISCA seems to have become very difficult. Earlier the climb was like this. I hope with this particular e-learning exercises, this e-learning lectures, this becomes much more easier. And using this, I assume that you have the knowledge and the skill set to be able to fly and go further. So chapter 1 pertaining to governance and management of information system, we have covered in this presentation. In addition to this, I've also given an introductory presentation on ISCA. I suggest if you've not gone through this, I request you to please go through the presentation. I hope this presentation has been useful to you and you learned. I suggest that you go back to the study material, read this again, underline the key points, make notes, think about it and internalize. This is what is most important. Don't read for the purpose of just remembering. Internalize and apply. And this is what is going to help you to score good marks in the ISCA paper. In fact, it's a mystery that students are not doing well in ISCA paper, although ISCA is the simplest paper if you look at it in terms of the complexity, because less than 400 pages and the concepts are repetitive in nature. If you know the underlying ideas of the concepts which are covered, like I told you about the risk, security, control, and audit, and you know, okay, what is the business framework, how it is used, what are the principles, you find the concepts are same and they're repeated in all the chapters. So even though there are 380 pages, if you remove the repetition, probably it's only about 250 pages. And the same underlying concept is there. So this is an area where you can definitely get very good marks. So I suggest you ask the 6 questions for each of the topics. Look at the learning objectives, look at the task statement which you got, look at the knowledge statement which you got. For each of the knowledge statement and the task statement, ask, do you know the answer? Ask the 6 questions, what is that particular area? For example, BCP, what is BCP? Why is BCP? How is BCP done? When is it required? So like that, if you ask these questions for six questions for any of these areas pertaining to ISCA, you'll find it becomes very easy to remember and understand. So thank you very much. I hope this presentation was useful to you. Wish you all the best and look forward to meeting you in the next presentation. Bye.